Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV, so come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter K.
Okay, so today is K Day, and that means we are going to do napping. No, not that kind of napping. Napping with a K. K-N-A-P-P-I-N-G. Napping. Now, this is a K word not like kenosos or that potato-y goodness knish, but sounds more like knowledge.
Knowledge.
Or not. Now, napping means the shaping of a hard stone, usually flint, but sometimes others like obsidian.
Must be dragon glass.
Dragon glass.
The maesters call it obsidian.
To create tools, often sharp ones. Now, what makes flint so special, so very nappable, is that its crystalline structure allows it to fracture well. So the experienced napper can carefully calibrate his or her strikes to produce the desired shape. And also, flint does have a tendency to retain its sharpness, so it's perfect for making stabbing weapons, arrowheads, another KN word, knives.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
So napping is the process of shaping stone to create these tools. And for most of human existence, and even pre-human, because a lot of our ancient hominid ancestors also created these types of tools, this was essential for survival, tools for hunting, and weapons for warfare. Now, why do archaeologists care so much about these basic stone tools? Well, that's simple. These stone tools can be used to date stuff. Now, I know what you're thinking, you don't date stone, and by and large, you're right, you don't. However, you can date the stuff around the stone, particularly organic matter that shares the same stratigraphic layer. So once you establish something as a stone tool, you can date the stuff around it to tell you how long ago humans made those tools. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily need to be organic matter. Organic matter is very useful because you can radiocarbon date it. But if you remember way back when we did that news article about the ancient carpenters in Zambia at that Kalambo Falls site, remember we used a process called thermoluminescence, which you can use to date silica-rich sediments like sand. So anyway, once you do establish something as a stone tool, you can use the context around it to establish very long ago human activity. Or again, as in the case of Kalambo Falls, could even be pre-human activity. And this type of dating has been very important in archaeological history. For example, in the 1980s, this type of dating is precisely what was used to date human presence in Brazil way back 22,000 years ago, when at the time it was thought to be only 10 or 12,000 years. So they did this by dating stone tools. And later in human history, like the Neolithic Age or the Bronze Age, this type of stone tool making became enough of an industry and a craft with regular shapes and sizes and implements of tools that seriations could be created. So just by looking at a stone tool, you could figure out the time frame it was made by placing it in one of those seriations. So this became another form of dating later on. And there are people who absolutely love this stuff, classifying, categorizing, and labeling stone tools to the most minute level of detail. And there are all kinds of these tools. There are arrowheads, axes, knives, piercers or awls, scrapers, You name it, there's all kinds of flint stones. So this raises the question, how to recognize stone that has been worked by human hands versus that which is just broken naturally? And it's not a dumb question, because there is a process called thermal expansion and contraction, basically stone expanding and contracting with big changes in temperature. That does happen, and it causes stone to shatter. This is the same way that wood expands and contracts with changing temperatures and seasons. Sometimes it's hard to yank that door closed or open. And believe it or not, with extreme changes in temperature, wood can shatter. You see that in very, very cold places like Lapland. And some naturally shattered stone tools can look suspiciously like human-made tools. So much so that it can lead to acrimonious debates as people try to establish human presence even earlier in an area. And these pictures are coming to you, by the way, from Peterborough Archaeology. So, because of these debates, people needed a system that they could reliably use to classify stones, identify them as worked by human hands. Now, there are three primary traits of worked stone, let's just say flint, and a piece of flint has to have 2 out of 3 of these generally to be considered worked by human hands. Now, why not all of them? Well, because we know a lot of these stones have been subject to erosion or breakage in other ways, so some of the features may have been knocked off. First, there should be a striking platform. That's the place where someone struck a chunk of flint, which is called a core, with a hammer stone, breaking off a flake. Now, this striking platform should be flattish, which allows someone to get a clean shot at the right angle to break a piece off at the desired shape, and that takes a ton of time to learn how to do. You really need to get a feel for the specific stone and the tools you're using in order to really get the correct angle and the appropriate amount of force. Second, there should be a bulb of percussion. This is an area right below the striking platform where the stone bows out so it becomes like a bulb, and that's from the force of the blow that broke off the flake. Third, there should be ripples, and these radiate away from the bulb of percussion, and they're created by the same force that created the bulb of percussion, and that force dissipates as it spreads downward through the piece of flint. Think of it kind of like throwing a stone into a pond, which creates ripples. Those ripples in the water dissipate as you get further away from the point of impact. This image right here shows it pretty clearly. Now, generally, you've got 2 out of those 3, the striking platform, the bulb of percussion, and the ripples, and you're good. However, there is a 4th one, which is not necessary to have to declare it worked stone. And in fact, many of the simple tools don't even have it, but those are signs of retouching. Basically, for more complex tools like axes or knives that are very sharp or with serrated edges, this is very fine retooling of those edges to get them very sharp and to get them into the desired shape. But again, not every stone tool is going to have that. Now, as I said before, there are folks who are absolutely enthralled by this. For example, there's a YouTuber called Primitive Hunter whose footage I borrowed just before. So if you actually want to take classes and learn how to do this, I've put some helpful links in the description. It might seem weird, but they have hundreds of thousands of views. Flint Knapping is a big business today. Personally, my favorite flint knapper is one of the most famous archaeologists in England. Sorry, Indy. He's with Wessex Archaeology, and that would be Phil Harding of Time Team fame. Anyway, this may seem like a simple topic, but it can get a lot more complicated. There's been a lot of experimental archaeology done on complex sites where this stuff was done on an industrial scale. Think about it. In really ancient times like Paleolithic and Mesolithic, people had a lot of time on their hands. Other than hunting and moving around, there wasn't much to do. So they sat around and they knapped a lot of flint, and they used it for everything. Even ethnoarchaeology can play a role, as there are many communities around the world today that still make and use stone tools, or even just keep them as ornaments or keepsakes. So who knew stone tools could be so complicated? And that's why we have K for napping.
Archaeology porn.
So, following on from our visit to early medieval Britain last week in the Game of Thrones episode, we are going to focus today's archaeology porn on a really hot number from that time period. And I know I usually like to diversify my content, but given that we just covered that and that I just visited this thing, I thought we should stay on the time period. And what is it that I just saw and just visited? That would be the Alfred Jewel. So what is the Alfred Jewel? It's an amazingly extravagant piece of early medieval British jewelry, which incorporates a lot of those techniques we discussed when we went over the Staffordshire hoard. So first, we have gold filigree. Now, if you remember, that's an incredibly painstaking process of soldering together tiny gold or silver beads and wire to create these very, very intricate and delicate designs like this here. And there you see some of that filigree on the side of the Alfred Jewel. Second, there's cloisonné, fancy French word. Now, what's that? Remember, that's the pressing down of enamel or stones in between gold or silver borders. And that's what's used to create this effect on the face of the jewel. If you recall, that's exactly what we saw in the Staffordshire hoard and also the Sutton Hoo burial treasures with all those garnets that are inlaid in the gold. That's cloisonné. And thirdly, we have, of course, all of these animal motifs. And in this case here, it's actually a mythical animal. Yep, that's right. It's a dragon. And we did see dragons or dragon-like creatures too in the Staffordshire hoard, like this one right here. And who could forget that belt buckle from the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which, in addition to having animal motifs hidden all over it, is really just a giant dragon's head. And perhaps the most famous piece from the Sutton Hoo ship burial, that helmet. If you look closely, you'll see the wings of the dragon or his eyebrows. The head of the dragon is somewhere up, by his forehead, and I suppose that's the tail of the dragon there, his mustache. And there are two other features which we haven't seen much of yet. First, protecting that enamel face is a tear-shaped quartz crystal, which we did not see in the Staffordshire hoard, and this is really what has protected the Alfred Jewel and kept it in its current state. And secondly, if you remember, there's almost nothing inscribed, no inscriptions in the Staffordshire hoard, which is one of the reasons it's so mysterious. All we had was that one measly inscription, which was a Bible verse. It was from a psalm. So there's not anything to really provenance the hoard, which is why it's such a mystery. Well, helpfully, the Alfred Jewel has a big old inscription on it, and we're going to get to that in a second because it's an important clue as to what this thing actually is. Now, before we get to the interpretation of this hot bit of archaeology porn, how did it actually come down to us? Well, it's pretty simple. It was plowed up in an agricultural field near Petherton Park, which is in County Somerset in the southwest of England, and that happened way back in 1693. Now, it was donated soon thereafter to the Oxford University, and then it eventually came down to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which to my mind is probably the second best museum in England behind the British Museum. If you recall from our site visit to Knossos, the guy who led that excavation, Arthur Evans, well, he was actually the director of the Ashmolean Museum, so there's a connection there. Now, what is this Alfred Jewel? Where did it come from? What does it mean? Well, unlike the Staffordshire hoard, there's actually a lot of good evidence for this one, so we don't really need to get too sciencey or into too much complex detective work.
No Sherlock.
First, let's start with the obvious. What does that inscription say? It says, Alfred Mechech Berkan, and I'm sorry I don't speak Old English, so sorry for that pronunciation to you aficionados out there. But anyway, in today's language, that means Alfred ordered me made. So who would this Alfred be? You guessed it, that would be Alfred the frickin' Great.
A day we make the pagans wish they'd never heard of Wessex. Today, we fight for Wessex.
And why might Alfred have had this made? Well, here we can practice some good historical archaeology. So, as shown here in The Last Kingdom, that hit show from a few years ago, and that's where I'm getting the footage, Alfred, in addition to being a great war leader, was a great patron of learning. And he insisted that not only the clergy, but also the elites in society should be literate. Prior to this, they were mostly illiterate, preferring to let their nerdy scribes do all the reading and writing for them. And so, unlike a lot of other kings of this period, we actually have a lot of written stuff from Alfred's court and reign. We have laws, charters, correspondence, and of course the life of Alfred, which was a very sensationalized and favorable biography written about Alfred by his counselor, a Welsh monk named Asser. Now, one of the things that Alfred did to promote learning around the kingdom, which remember, learning and teaching was almost exclusively through the church at this point, was he translated copies of Pope Gregory's book on pastoral care and sent them around to the churches in England. And what pastoral care did was it taught people the responsibilities of being a clergy at this time. So this was a twofer. It was not only sort of sending a book around that was in high Latin and teaching it to people in English, but it was also helping the clergy to be better Christians and better at their responsibilities. Because, remember, at this time, we still had plenty of drunken monks, priests, and bishops who didn't know shit and were basically just put in their positions because of their connection. Oh! They were the lesser children of nobility in many cases. And who was this Pope Gregory? Well, he actually lived a long time before this, in the 6th century, so 300 some odd years before this. And he was actually the same pope that sent that mission to re-Christianize England after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Anyway, in his preface to the book, and I guess copies of that still survive, or maybe some of the originals, Alfred did put a little note, and I'm going to have to read this. He wrote, "And I will send a copy to every bishop's see in my kingdom, and in each book there is an astel of 50 mancuses, and I command in God's name that no man take the staff from the book, nor the book from the church." So what exactly does that mean? I'm going to have to translate two key terms here. First, a mancus was a standardized weight of gold coin, which was actually equivalent to an Arab gold dinar. Remember, there actually was international trade at this time, and we saw that in the Sutton Hoo burial and other goods from the time. Now, fun fact, prior to this, there were actually gold coins in England that were found to have bastardized Arabic on them. One of these came from the reign of King Offa from the kingdom of Mercia, and I think this was about 100 years before Alfred the Great. Now, this coin that you're seeing, on one side it says Offa Rex, which means Offa, king, and on the other side there's actually the Muslim declaration of faith in poorly written Arabic, and it says, "There is no God but Allah alone." Wow. If only these Christians knew what they put on their coins. Anyway, I got off track. Let's return to the Alfred Jewel. So Alfred's preface says he's sending this book on pastoral care to all the bishoprics in England, along with an astel of 50 mancuses. And those 50 menkeses, well, that would be a goodly value in that time. Probably, a few months' salary for a skilled craftsman or other profession in that day and age. And that this astle or staff is not to be removed from the book, and the book is not to be removed from the churches. But what is an astle? Well, an astle can mean a few different things. It can mean a guide, it can mean an index, but in this particular context, it probably means a pointer. You see, in this day and age, of course, books were written and illuminated by hand, a long, painstaking, and expensive process. So, in order to protect the books, people read with a pointer as not to smudge the ink with their nasty fingers. And actually, this practice exists still today. You see, we Jews, we have our holy book called the Torah, and that is still a big scroll which is written by hand. So we use pointers, or called a yad in Hebrew, to read the Bible each week, and that's what you're seeing here. And if we look at the Alfred Jewel, we can even see the little slot where the pointer, probably made of some kind of bone like ivory, would have fit right in. And although the Alfred Jewel is definitely the most elaborate surviving example, there were a few other objects that look just like this and probably served the same purpose from Anglo-Saxon England. Now, there's one other fun factoid that ties this to Alfred as well, and that is the find site at Petherton Park. Now, that place is less than 10 miles away from Athelney, which is that swampy area where Alfred hid out and led his successful guerrilla campaign against the Vikings, thereby saving England's independence and sort of forging the nation. Now, unfortunately, if you go there today, Athelney, all you see is this stupid monument. And we have Henry VIII to thank for that, because he, of course, led the destruction and the dissolution of the monasteries, among those Alfred's monastery at Athelney, which was probably broken up and sold for scrap stone, a very inglorious end. However, this site was the very first site on Time Team, my favorite archaeological show ever. So, in sum, just about everything about the Alfred Jewel screams Alfred the Great. But what is the image on there? Who is this dude? Who does it represent? Well, for this, other contemporaneous artifacts do give us some hints. Now recall, Alfred was all about learning.
Nerds! Nerds! Nerds!
And he figured you needed all 5 senses to learn, but chief among these, of course, was sight, which you needed for reading. There was no Braille at that time, and he called that the mind's eye. Now, this concept is expressed on other high-status objects of the time, but the most elaborate of these is found in the British Museum, and that is the Fuller brooch. Now, the Fuller brooch shows the 4 supporting senses for learning: taste, hearing, smell, and touch, around the center of the brooch, where we find the primary sense for learning, sight. And it's believed that perhaps that figure on the Alfred Jewel with the big eyes, well, that represents the same thing we find at the center of the Fuller brooch, that figure for sight. So that's all pretty clear, right? We're done here. Well, not exactly. There are probably 2 outstanding issues that are not totally done and dusted. First, there's that inscription, Alfred ordered me made. Well, in this era of very strict social hierarchy, it's kind of odd not to have Rex next to Alfred, Alfred the King. After all, this was not a day and age where we called our leaders Bill, George, Joe, or Donald. However, the preponderance of the evidence is so strong in linking this to Alfred the Great that I think even though the inscription doesn't have Rex with it, I'd be willing to bet that that's exactly who this is talking about. But that still leaves the figure on the face of the Alfred Jewel. As I've suggested, it could represent sight, but it also could be Christ as well, because in early Christian times, where we are right now, there was a very common depiction of Christ called Christ in Majesty, which shows him holding a book. And for that reason, it's often used to connote wisdom or enlightenment, And it makes sense that that would be sort of the figure chosen if Alfred was sending around a book meant to teach people and, that they could learn. However, there has been some recent speculation that that figure actually represents Alexander the Great. Now, I know that sounds far-fetched, but hear me out. I actually think it is plausible. You see, in this early Middle Ages, early medieval times, even though the memory of antiquity and learning of the classics was largely forgotten, only to be revived later in the Renaissance period, people at this time still did idolize Alexander the Great as the consummate warrior king. And there are many versions of a particular story about him, which of course is not true. It's a legend or a myth. And even though Alexander the Great was definitely a historical figure, of course, after he died very young, there were lots of these kind of tall tales that sprung up about him. Well, in a quest to see the whole world which he had conquered, Alexander the Great wanted to see it from above, the whole world. So he harnessed 2 griffins, or large birds, and actually to coax them higher, he held skewers of meat above their heads so they would just keep flying up to grab that meat. So those 2 things in his hands, those could either be the harnesses to hold the birds, or they could be the skewers to coax them to fly higher. And this particular image was not uncommon in medieval times. You could find it in Europe. You could find it even in the Middle East. And this picture here, that's an example from a church in southern Italy. However, regardless of who the figure actually represents, whether it be Sight personified, Christ in majesty, or Alexander the Great harnessing a bunch of big birds, the message is still really the same. The purpose of this is wisdom, it's knowledge. That's exactly what Alfred was doing in sending this translation of pastoral care all around England. So here we've used the contemporary material record, art history, historical archaeology, and pretty much good old-fashioned common sense to help us to figure out what this Alfred Jewel actually was. But one thing that's certain and completely indisputable, this is a lurid example of hot archaeology porn. And that's a wrap.
Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
All right, just a couple of quick stories for this week's archaeology news. First, an interesting little tidbit just popped up about Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and because we just did a site visit there, I'm of course going to have to cover that one. Now, it's not strictly speaking archaeology, but it is genetics, so that's something we talk quite a lot about. Fair game on this show. Well, if you'll recall, the island and its people were devastated in the 19th century due to the activities of missionaries on the island from mainland Chile and the other Europeans that showed up who had designs on how to exploit the island. Now, one of the ventures they had in mind was winemaking, and of course that had been already traditionally imported into mainland Chile, where it became kind of a traditional industry in the country. Okay, not that traditional, but you get the idea. Well, fast forward to 2021, and a modern vineyard was established on Easter Island, which will hopefully bring some sustainable economic development there to supplement the tourism which is going on. Now, of course, it turns out this is not the first time winemaking has been done there. You see, wild grapes were already growing all over the island, and those were left over from that long ago winemaking venture by the missionaries and Europeans. And we know this thanks to some documentary evidence from that time. You see, way back in 1860s, those missionaries who would go on to screw up the island so badly were in charge. And they had a problem, because they needed wine for their weekly mass. And as we know, Rapa Nui is so isolated that trading ships were very, very few and far between. So they had some vines brought from the mainland, which they planted near the church in Hangarau with the intention of making wine. And voila, you've got a winemaking industry. And as you see, those missionaries got it right, that the conditions in Rapa Nui were comparable to that of another volcanic island, Madeira, which of course was a hotbed for viticulture. And having been to Madeira, I can tell you that they definitely know how to make a good vintage there. In fact, Madeira was the source of most of the wine imports for the early United States back before, when it was a colony, before independence, and even after independence in the early days of the Republic. Well, as you probably remember, on Rapa Nui, the whole colonialism thing didn't work out too well. And pretty soon, those missionaries were fighting a mini-war with that French bag, Jean-Baptiste Dutrou-Bornier, and as a result of that, both sides in that mini-war evacuated large portions of the population out of Rapa Nui to work and live elsewhere. And as a result, those grapes that were planted by the church became wild and untended. However, far from dying off, those grapes actually spread all over the island to lots of different locations. And just recently, a team of researchers thought to test those grapes genetically to see what variety they were that survived so well. And they were doing this in support of the island's new wine industry as they hope to further develop that. And they published their findings in the New Zealand Journal of Botany. And New Zealand, like Chile, as we know, is a nation that's known for its wine. So it all kind of makes sense. And man, did those grapes grow everywhere. Just look at them here all over the crater, that volcanic crater, just north of Orongo Ceremonial Village, all the way at the southern tip of the island. And overall, the team sampled sites from 13 different locations on the island. And what did they find? Well, the genome sequenced identified 5 varieties that are known from mainland Chile and beyond. And these have names like San Francisco, Muscat of Alexandria, etc. However, curiously, they found one variety whose genome didn't match any known cultivar. So you just know, given how snobbish wine fanatics can be, that some fancy sommelier is going to make that into a rare and exotic variety that's going to be served on the tables of some Michelin star restaurant somewhere. And I must say that this doesn't totally surprise me. You see, winemaking viticulture has long been a global industry, with vines making it all around the world as far back, I think, as even the 16th century. And grapes, like a lot of plants, are actually subject to pandemics. So, for example, in the 1800s in France, there was the Great Wine Blight, which destroyed a lot of the crop in that country. And little known fact, a lot of the grapes there were then imported from the US, where the grapes had built up a resistance already to the blight, which was caused by a certain pest. So France, with its great wine industry, actually has the US to thank for that. So in all that interbreeding, this little guy on Rapa Nui might be the lone survivor of a long-lost cultivar that has since disappeared in the wider world. So you go, Rapa Nui, you work that niche. Okay, so moving on to Poland, where a bear bone found in a cave way back in the 1950s is yielding new insights thanks to a paper recently published by some local researchers. Now, this bone was found in a cave that was rich with the remains of other ancient animals, wolves, foxes, you name it, dozens of varieties. This cave is in a karst region of Poland, and karst is that limestone that creates those lovely mountains in places in the world like Guilin, China, or is perfect for forming caves, like in parts of Slovenia. If you look, they even put a castle into this one. It was determined to be the rib of a bear, and you can clearly see those scratches, which were definitely made by intelligent life forms, some kind of a hominid. And based on the stratigraphic layer it was found in, and the faunal remains it was found with, we know that this bear was from approximately 115,000 to 130,000 years ago, when it's well attested that our friends the Neanderthals inhabited this region. And so, based on that dating way back to what was called the Eemian period, and the regularity of those scratch marks, this piece of bone was named probably the earliest piece of representational or symbolic art in Europe, and it therefore became a very famous item. However, there's one problem. Those judgments were all made on the basis of simple observation. The bone itself was never really subjected to any rigorous scientific observation, so that's exactly what this team did. Now, the paper isn't quite clear on this point, but that actually was misidentified as a rib bone. It was not a rib bone of a bear, it was the radius of a bear. But what isn't clear to me is if this current team was the one who made that correction, or if that had already been done earlier by other researchers. Moreover, based on the lack of fusion in the bones and traces of the muscle attachments, the team determined that this was a juvenile bear, probably a brown bear, which still roam Europe today. I actually saw one in Slovenia. Anyway, they subjected the bone to lots of high-tech analyses using advanced microscopes, laser scanning, microphotogrammetry, basically taking super close-up 3D images. And using these techniques, they were able to get really, really precise measurements of those scratches, like the depth, the angles, etc. Then they did a bunch of experimental archaeology to see if they could replicate these cut marks. And what did they find? First of all, given the regularity, they determined this was done in one sitting. And there was also no useful purpose to making the cut, so this isn't consistent with butchering. Second, they determined that the cut marks were made with a retouched stone tool, and based on our K for knapping that we did this week, you know exactly what that means, a retouched stone tool. And finally, they were able to determine, based on the angle of the cut marks, that it was a right-handed person that made them. It's amazing how much science can teach us about the minute details of technology and activity long ago. However, I do have one problem with this paper, which is that I think it's overinterpreted. I think they're making a little bit too much of a stretch in their determination about what this means. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on this particular team, but I do, again, think it was a little bit of a stretch to say that this is definitely an example of representational or symbolic artwork. And it's not because I don't think Neanderthals were capable of that. In fact, we know they were. They painted stuff with pigments for ornamental purposes. In fact, some of those cave paintings we've discussed a few times, those were made by Neanderthals, like this one here in Spain. So it's not that I think Neanderthals were incapable of making this type of artwork. Yet, just because these cut marks were regular, deliberate, and done with no particular utilitarian purpose, does not necessarily make them an example of representational art. Now, how do I know this? I sort of unwittingly did an ethnographic experiment myself. Now, when I was a kid, probably 8 or 9 years old, my parents bought me my first knife for fishing and sailing and other outdoor kind of stuff. And I remember one day just sitting there kind of by an old table at my house, just kind of scoring it with a knife, making regular tick marks. Now, these marks were deliberate, they were regular, and they were done in one sitting without any utilitarian purpose in mind. But were they art? No. I was actually just bored. I wasn't even paying attention to what I was doing. And guess what? My parents were not happy with the results of my labors. And that's something that's often overlooked about past times. Life must have actually been really boring. Other than hunting, sleeping, eating, there really wasn't a whole lot to do. There weren't very elaborate cultures and rituals that took up a lot of time in non-necessary type of stuff. So people had a lot of time on their hands to play with their stone tools and to make their stone tools. So on this piece of bone, that's very well what could have been going on. Someone was just bored and making cut marks on the bone. So I'm not saying the team who interpreted this is wrong. I'm just saying I'm skeptical. And that's how you critically read the archaeology news. You're allowed to use your own brain. Don't just blindly trust the experts. All right, so that's the archaeology news for this week. See you next time. Hey, If you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.